Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sandro Galea, and I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the Boston University School of Public Health. On behalf of our school, welcome to today's Public Health Conversation. These public health conversations are meant to be spaces where we can come together to discuss the issues that matter most to health. Guided by experts, we engage with these issues towards shaping a conversation that supports a healthier world. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and thank you to those who work to make events like today happen, particularly the Dean's Office and marketing and communications teams. We are in a historical moment that has clearly elevated the importance of leadership. A range of crises, from the pandemic to the war in Ukraine, have shown how the actions of leaders, both good and bad, shape the health of populations. It is a time for asking, what makes a good leader? How can we model effective leadership as individuals and as a field? Donato Tramuto has written a new book to help us answer these questions. The Double Bottom Line, How Compassionate Leaders Captivate Hearts and Deliver Results, does much to express the role that compassion plays in good leadership. It is a subject that resonated with me. I have long felt that compassion is core to understanding the structures that underlie health, that compassion helps us to see how health links to the world around us and calls on us to intervene when we see inequities. The Tramuto Porter Foundation and Boston University School of Public Health are proud to partner in promotion of compassionate leadership in support of social justice, human rights, and health issues across local and global communities. Our collaboration will result in a suite of lifelong learning activities, a compassionate leadership curriculum, and the newly endowed Tramuto Porter Compassionate Leadership Endowed Scholarship Fund. Back in October, Donato joined us for a conversation about compassionate leadership, and you can find it archived on our website. We are very happy to welcome him back here today in the company of a distinguished group of leaders whose collective work has done much to improve health and the conditions that shape it. I'm now going to introduce our guests, after which we're going to have a conversation among our guests and taking questions from the audience about how compassion can inform leadership in the present moment. First, I will introduce Jeff Arnold. Jeff is CEO and chairman of ShareCare, a digital health company that helps people manage all their health in one place. He also founded WebMD and Quality Diagnostic Services, one of the first organizations to use the concept of telemedicine more than 25 years ago. I should say that I'm doing very brief introductions for very distinguished guests just to move on with the conversation. Next, we have Bruce Broussard on our panel. Bruce serves as president and CEO of Humana, one of the nation's leading healthcare companies based in Kentucky. He also plays a leadership role in key business organizations such as the Business Roundtable and the Business Council. Then we have Janine Broussard. Janine worked as a nurse for 10 years in a cardiac unit and operating room at the Holy Spirit Hospital in Pennsylvania. Since then, she has devoted her life to helping others. In 2015, Janine launched the Help US Grow Foundation, a not-for-profit focused on early childhood learning and development. Next, we have Scott Minerd. Scott serves as chairman of the Guggenheim Investments and global chief investment officer. He's a longtime advisor to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and currently serves on the International Monetary Fund's External Advisor Group. Then we have Ash Rogers. Ash is the co-chief executive of Luwala Community Alliance. Luwala works in Western Kenya and has driven a 300% increase in contraceptive use and 64% decrease in deaths for children under 5 and nearing zero mother-to-child transmission of HIV. And finally, of course, we have Donato Tramuto. Donato is the author of The Double Bottom Line that I discussed earlier. He's a global health activist, former CEO of Tivity Health, and founder of the Tramuto Foundation and Health e-Villages. Donato was the recipient of the prestigious Robert F. Kennedy Ripple of Hope Award in 2014 and the 2017 Robert F. Kennedy Embracing His Legacy Award. Everybody, thank you for joining us. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. So let me start with a lead question, and I'll start it for you, Donato. Why a book on compassionate leadership? Let's start with there.
Thank you, Sandro. And before I answer that question, I also just want to acknowledge that Scott was the 2015 recipient of the RFK Ripple of Hope, and Bruce was the 2018 recipient. I'm really honored to be with these two laureates whose history of compassion and doing good for the world has touched me deeply. And so Bruce and Scott, great to be with two RFK laureates.
Thank you.
To answer your question, we're living in unprecedented times. Never before in our lifetime has there been such widespread disruption in our daily lives and major shifts in how people work, connect, and solve problems. And I think in times of uncertainty, we look to our leaders to give us a source of direction, reassurance, and hope, along with guidance on how to chart our way forward. Yet, I still see too much of the old face of leadership in organization today. This is a top-down, hierarchical, the boss has all the answers type of leadership that focuses more on productivity and profit than people. And I truly believe that that doesn't work anymore. Today's workforce is too young, too diverse, too disengaged, too tired of not being heard and respected. And that's why we need a new model of leadership, one that is necessarily people focused in addition to performance and profit focus. We're not saying it's one or the other. And I think today's leaders need to manage the double bottom line of bettering conditions for people and bettering business results for their companies to survive and thrive and for them to succeed in their roles as leaders. And when I came up with the concept of the double bottom line, I didn't want it to be according to Donato. I had met, and they're on this panel today, some amazing leaders in my lifetime who had demonstrated this new mindset, this new skill, and this new understanding of the workforce in order to achieve success for their teams and organizations. I remember the first time that I met Bruce in particular, and Bruce shared with me that every time he opens up his executive meeting, he always asks the questions about the members and his people. And that touched me. Here I was in the presence of this enormously talented and successful executive, yet he really understood how to put people and his members first. And so most leaders will say they agree that compassionate leadership is a good thing, but studies and our own studies prove that while they believe that they're practicing compassion, they're really not practicing it. And that's why I wrote the book, to provide a playbook that will show leaders how to adopt a more modern, more compassionate leadership style by weaving, if you will, research-backed advice and real-world examples from these 40 compassionate leaders. And lastly, it's my hope that in this book, it will act as a leadership primer for future generations of leaders, and for any leader at any level who needs to learn or relearn the essential skills needed to succeed in today's world.
Thank you, Donato. So I'm going to go around now and ask each of our panels. By the way, in case people are wondering, I'm doing this alphabetically. And maybe I can ask each of you to say, well, what does compassionate leadership mean for you? And what have you taken from your intellectual engagement with this idea? Jeff, maybe I'll start with you.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. I think compassion is, very important to well-being, Sandro, as you mentioned, and the approach that we've taken over the years is what we call compassionate products. So, how do you work with your team and build trust and define a mission that creates compassionate products? So whether it's sending in tech-enabled home care folks into seniors' homes to work on social isolation, do companionship, or it's building compassionate products to get people their medical records in hours, not days, or it's investing in mindfulness apps that are evidence-based that help people become more self-aware. The approach that we've taken over the years, being in healthcare and building tech-enabled products is compassionate products. And we do that by, working with our teams and making sure that it's extremely authentic and that we believe that what we're building is truly going to be compassionate and get people to engage in ways that they maybe haven't engaged in their well-being in the past.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Let me go to Bruce.
Well, again, thank you. And Donato, thank you for doing this. I think your leadership here and continuing to reinforce compassion is really needed, because sometimes we all forget about it in the day-to-day fights that we have. So this continued reminder is very helpful for all of us. I would say, from a leadership point of view, having humility and being able to lead with humility, and that has so many avenues to it. One is around just being transparent. Second, being really thoughtful and having empathy for people. The third is what I find in leadership is the biggest asset a leader has is the questions they ask. And the example of asking about how's our customers doing and how's our teammates doing. I find, when you ask those questions, it really helps set direction of what is important. If you constantly ask about the financial performance, that's going to set where the priorities are. And so as a leader, I think starting from a purpose, leading with humility, and then using that humility as a rookie to really constantly ask questions, I have found to be sort of a source of people feeling that there is compassion in the air, because every day what you do is really a reinforcement of that compassion.
Thank you. Janine? I think you're
I'm
muted.
sure I'm mute.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm honored to be here. And Donato, thank you for putting this all together. And I'm sorry to say, but Bruce Broussard has all of my lingo and language because we share so many of the same conversations. I'm so proud to be part of his life and understanding his leadership. And I've taken that leadership and emulated it and help us grow foundation. And so when we talk to our members, talk to our teammates, we're in a collaborative environment. So we're transparent and we are always building and evolving together. And so our compassionate component is do good to feel good, to make others feel good. And so everything that we want to emulate is just giving back and helping other people grow. And in turn, I just wanted to build a culture to grow our employees the same way. So all of our tutors, all of our retired teachers, we want to give back and help them grow and just share that collaborative experience with them. And so that's how we provide some compassion in our culture. Thank you for having me.
I like that do good to feel good for everybody. Scott.
Sandra, I find it interesting that I had a career in Wall Street, and Wall Street is a pretty brutal environment. And one of the most elementary parts of that brutality is the market itself. Because no matter the very nature of your decision-making process, when you're wrong, you're wrong. And there is very little tolerance out of clients or other people when they're giving you a piece of their wealth and you lose money because they expect there to get a positive return. So there's this issue around what I would call the discipline that is necessary to perform the function, but yet the compassion issue. And I'm reminded of Tolstoy's book, Master and Man. And for those who aren't familiar with it, it's the story of the master with his serf or his slave. And he decides to take the sleigh out one night, and he goes from house to house, and at each place he's welcomed, and they're taken into palaces and so on and so forth. And the master lives this very elaborate life and of privilege, but the serf is sent to go to the shed behind the house where he sits with the other serfs, and they try to keep themselves warm until the master calls again. But what's interesting in Master and Man, if you've read it, is that the story ends with the sleigh being caught in a snowdrift in a blizzard. And when the blizzard occurred, the master got underneath the sleigh, and he left his servant to lay in the back of the sleigh, and the snow came down. They never returned home. And so when they went out to look for them, they found the servant in the top of the sleigh with the master laying on top of him. And the master had frozen to death, but the servant was alive. And I think the point is that in environments which are difficult and demanding, like the world of investments, is to convey as much as you can to people that ultimately the people who are in charge are the ones who sacrifice. And they have a greater responsibility than just living to the bottom line and how much money the company is making, but they're there to be the caretaker of the employees and the people that are in their employ, and being the partner of the firm, who is one of the largest shareholders. That responsibility falls on my shoulders most of the time.
Thank you, Scott. Ash.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the comments from the other panelists. I wanted to offer a concept from Sub-Saharan Africa called Ubuntu. which just directly means I am because we are. And it's the idea that the individual and the defining of the individual is all wrapped up in their relationship to others. And to me, that's really the root of the idea of compassion. It's really discovering the truth in ourselves, that our own pursuit of freedom, of well-being, is tangled up in the freedom and well-being of others. And so as we look to lead organizations, when we look to lead Luala, we use a concept called community-led development, where we're continually seeking to find ways to put our frontline health workers, and really importantly, our clients, at the center of identifying challenges, defining solutions, and evaluating the services that we provide. And we use a tool for that called the participatory continuum, where we take all of the services across our organization and we plot them on a continuum from coercion or top-down service provision to community-driven ideas and implementation of solutions. And our goal is to continually move our services along that continuum to be increasingly participatory, increasingly human-centered, and increasingly rooted in compassion.
Thank you. Let me, there's a question from Emma Watson, which I want to get to. It overlaps with what I was going to ask. But Donato, maybe ask you this question. Often organizations that are successful have compassionate leadership. That's fine. But where do I start if I were in a different kind of organization? And Emma mentions a struggling healthcare organization, but I think it can apply to many organizations. So if that's not the case, where does one start?
Well, I think that what we learned, and by the way, it wasn't only the one-on-one interviews that we had with these 40 wonderful leaders. We also conducted a survey with 1,500 individuals across the United States. And so that was not a part of the book initially. And I'm glad that we did decide to look at the viewpoints of the employee population. So I think where you start first is understanding the definition of compassion and what we learned. And by the way, I did not approach the book with this definition, but what I learned from these 40 leaders and from the 1,500 people that we surveyed, that compassionate leadership is not just about being kind or being empathetic. It's empathy in action. And it's very funny, once we came up with that definition and I started to trace back my career, and I wasn't always a compassionate leader. Let me, get that out, in the open. But what I did learn, especially in the last 20, 25 years, that when I saw something wrong, when something wasn't necessarily going well with an employee and they were in pain, that I did demonstrate taking action. And we saw that in every one of the leaders and the panelists who are with us today. So I think it starts first with understanding the definition, and we unwrap that definition in the book. And I think if you start there, then I think you can do a lot of good in the future in recognizing that if you see somebody in pain and you just walk away, you've only really executed on, part of that definition.
Yeah, let me build on that and ask the next question. Maybe Scott, I can ask you to lead on this question, because you mentioned your time working in a brutal environment in Wall Street. What are the benefits of compassionate leadership beyond creating a better environment for people? How do you make the case for the role of compassionate leadership in very, let's call it, single bottom line driven organizations, if I may?
Well, it's interesting. Donato started out talking about some of the things that are done in businesses to be productive, sort of the hierarchical business. One of the things that I encourage people to do is express their opinion and to have it be heard. Even though that, I'm a formidable force, both by personality and position, I tell people all the time that, if they differ in what I'm saying, or if they differ with somebody else in the organization on their view, that they have an obligation to speak up. And to say why they differ and to have a civil conversation. What I found over time is that sort of dialogue actually enhances productivity and the quality of the things that we do. And so, setting that tone from the top, is an important thing. Now, the challenge I found, which I started out with, was, there's this element of balancing that with discipline, because at the end of the day, as I tell people, certain people are delegated responsibility to make decisions. My portfolio managers are responsible for ultimately making the decisions for their client's portfolio. They have lots of resources to pull on and lots of people to talk with. But at the end of the day, they have to make the decision. It can't be a collective decision, because it's not like we can necessarily get together and vote and do it. But that also brings with it accountability. And so, having a way to have people be accountable, to have a culture of accountability, is a very important thing. But it doesn't have to be brutal. One of the things we do to help with accountability when people are, failing in certain areas of their job or certain aspects, is to make management coaching available. I mean, we work with UCLA, and we have an independent management coach, and you can avail yourself of that and say, I've been told I'm not performing well in this category. How do I improve? How do I improve my communication with my boss? How do I improve my communication with my peers? And so, it really creates an environment that is much more friendly, very powerful, from the standpoint that people are encouraged to share ideas. No one individual has all the answers to every question. And by creating that culture, I think it creates an environment that people enjoy being in, and ultimately leads to higher productivity and higher profits.
Thank you. Janine, maybe I can address the next question to you, if I may. So if you were to suggest one thing that a leader could do to make compassion a centerpiece into their leadership, what would that be?
Be transparent, be the role model. Be the role model of the organization, and be transparent, and try to go from the bottom up. Really just engage all of the members from the bottom up. And again, to just expound on what he was saying in previous, is to let them express their opinions and collaborate with those opinions and find solutions.
Thank you. Ash, maybe I can ask you to build on that a little bit, because you talked a little bit about the in the context of leadership with real engagement with the community. And I was wondering if you can comment a little bit on what does that mean when you actually when there's leadership that is embedded within community and community action. How does transparency translate then, and how does a leader hold themselves accountable, to use Scott's term, to the right compassion both within the organization and within the community that they're serving?
Yeah, thanks so much. And, I think it's important to kind of root that in the organization that I support, Lawala, which was founded by a community in Kenya, and their real belief and shock and horror at the intolerance for the injustice that they didn't have access to healthcare. And so they self-organized, they donated community land and resources, and then they created Lawala Community Alliance. And from that, all of our services start with a community committee that's made up of the clients who we're serving. And it's that committee that drives forward the work that we provide, the work that we do. And I think that sounds real nice on the outset. It's democracy, so wonderful. We all are part of a democracy, and we know, if you've ever been to a school board meeting or a PTA meeting or a town hall, you know that type of engagement and community decision making is anything but kind. it's there's a lot of conflict that happens when we are trying to pull forward solutions to challenging problems that affect our lives. And democracy comes with conflict. It comes with that back and forth and a tension and a messiness. And so I think the role of a leader and that gets replicated in our organizations, right? If you go and spend time with your frontline workers, you will find all sorts of challenges and messiness and a plurality of ideas and opinions. And I think it's really our job as leaders to absorb that, to leave room for there to be disagreement and differing opinions, and help to push forward decision-making. And I think Scott really touched on this, that like you do need to have a decision-making framework that is clear and straightforward, but that doesn't mean you can't listen and have really great outlets for those opinions to evolve. And that is often where innovation is sparked, is when you have this creative tension, you allow there to be different multiple voices, and then you try something and see how it unfolds. And so I think that's really where participation, compassion, and clear, transparent decision-making can help push forward compassionate organizations.
Thank you. Let me take it this slightly different tack, and Jeff, maybe I can address this question to you. This is one from Regina Anderson, one of our participants. Can you give an example of trying to be compassionate at the time when you tried to be compassionate and it didn't work, and what you learned from that?
Well, to be honest, I think I learn every day about compassion, how to be a compassionate leader when we went through the pandemic, and, how we had to get remote overnight to take care of the employees and patients that were part of Share Care. As Scott mentioned, how do you be a compassionate leader as you take a company public and you go through a SPAC, and you have people investing in your company and employees that have options, and maybe the stock price isn't going in the direction that you want it to do for reasons sometimes you can control and sometimes you can't. And being able to react, always to that situation in a way that, is consistent. And the way that we've tried to be consistent, in that, and it doesn't always work, is just be, very transparent, is that, this is what we're trying to accomplish. This is the role that you have in that mission. This is what we're trying to do together as a team, and then try to use data to be able to measure that. And by having the data, create that transparency. But it doesn't always work. But what I have found that the best approach to be over time is to create that data-driven dialogue. That, we live in this time where we create so much information. How do you relay that information real time back to people in which the information matters most to, in a way that helps them understand the situation and what actions we're trying to take to always improve it.
Yeah, Sandro, may I just add to that?
Please.
I think Jeff is being a little bit too humble here, because we do have a great example. In 2016, when I had taken over Activity Health, I moved from chairman to CEO. At that time, it was Healthways. We had two divisions, one that was performing and then one that was not performing. And the pressure, Scott, from the market was, Donato, make a decision quickly, shut down the other division. And I have lived by this leadership mantra, and we introduce it in the book, called the 3 T's. The first T is tenderness. The second T is tenderness to get the trust, and the third T is tenacity. In that specific situation, I could have shut the division down, and I would have had an enormous amount of applause from the marketplace. But what I did is I practiced the first T first. I met with over 2,000 employees in the company in my first 6 months as CEO. And what I learned is that we didn't have the capabilities to continue that organization. And by the way, we would not be able to sell that division. I called Jeff Arnold, and he practiced what is another word that I introduced in the book called collaboration. It's the innovation with collaboration. Jeff and I came up with this concept rather than sell the company or shut it down and have 2,000 employees on the street. We would hand the division over to Jeff and actually pay Jeff to take the division. That had never been done before, at least in my understanding, where you pay another company 25 million to take a division when you put $1 billion into it. Jeff showed a willingness to be compassionate, and it was a risk because, quite frankly, we asked him to take all the employees for a period of time so that he could determine what and how to make this division successful in his new company. My point is, we did this in a public market forum, and the next day when we made the announcement, the stock doubled. But there is no spreadsheet. Nobody asked us, how do the employees feel about this? How did you reach the decision by including the employees? And what Jeff and I demonstrated was this willingness to show tenderness, listen to what the employees were telling us about the division. And then we came up with a solution that worked for everyone. And on day one, when we made the announcement, we didn't have one chaotic interruption from employees and from customers. And so there's a great example of how you can take risk if you take the time to listen to your employees. I like what Janine said, start with bottoms up. Go into the community. As my favorite philosopher, Yogi Berra, once said, you don't want to make the wrong mistake. We're going to make mistakes, but let's try to avoid the wrong mistakes. And Jeff, I always applaud you because you could have said, no, I'm not going to do this. And it was a risk for your company. But together we collaborated and we came up with an innovative solution that benefited the customers, that benefited the employees, and quite frankly, it became a successful division within ShareCare.
Sure.
These themes are emerging, which is actually really interesting, on accountability, transparency, communication, which I hear from all of you. I think Ash and Janine, you both set the stage for that. Bruce, maybe I can ask you a next question. I often worry in these kind of conversations that the phrase that comes to my mind is, humility is a strange thing. Once you think you have it, you've lost it. And I just worry that maybe we talk too much about compassion. And I was just wondering if you can go a little bit deeper and say, how does a leader actually know they're really being compassionate rather than just saying they're compassionate?
It's an interesting question because I do think, especially as you gain more and more responsibility, you sometimes think that you have compassion, but when you go and really look underneath the covers, it's not really being perceived that way. I find a few things there. I think first, continuing to measure and understand from the feedback from the people you serve, and I really believe constantly understanding their perspective is an important part of that. And whether that's with your teammates and engagement scores, whether that's through various different customer surveys that you participate in, and hearing it from them. And I do find that gives you some indication. And I think there's a ton of technology out there today that gives you sentiment and all the other information that allows you to make that understanding. And I find that honest feedback, especially feedback that can be given without attribution, is really a great way for you to understand how you're proceeding. I'll give you an example that I have found to be very effective in getting a response back. We have 90,000 employees in our company, and every Monday I send out a note, and it's a page and a half, and it has different context on it. Sometimes it's got a lot of personal stuff. I know Janine, my son Clay, and Carly, and my dogs, and all the other things relative to my family. But they also, I link it to public events that are going on in the world, and always end it with a customer story, but always ask for feedback. And I find when I get that feedback, I get good feedback and I get bad feedback. And we always, again, it's not attributed there. And it really allows me to understand, both as a leader, what's on the people's mind and perspective, and in addition from the individual themselves, where they are, because we have such diverse opinions. And I think this is a little bit what Scott was talking about, embracing diverse opinions through and allowing people to speak and express themselves, and then utilize that as a way to advance the organization. Because I find always when I listen and I ask for feedback, and ask for opinions, the decision is always better. When you go into something that is, you think you know the answer and you ignore others' opinions, you usually are going to come out in not a very good place. And so this idea of how do you sort of understand if you have compassion, it's about how people feel, it's how they express themselves, and the ability to gain that expression, whether it's good or bad, is an important part of the leader.
Thank you. That's actually really interesting. Thank you, Bruce. Donato, let me ask you this question, which builds on something Regina is asking in the Q&A. But I think it builds nicely on what Bruce just said. Can you talk a little bit about rituals, and maybe I will add to that habits of mind that within an organization make sense to build in to try to create not just compassionate leadership, but create a compassionate organization?
Now, it's a very, very good question. And this is going to shock a lot of the viewers and perhaps even some of our panelists. I don't think that culture comes first in the organization, and we write about that in the book, that there's been this old adage that culture eats strategy for lunch. And I think we need to throw that out. I think trust eats culture and strategy for lunch. If you cannot get the trust in the organization first, and I love what Bruce said. Bruce, when you were giving the overview of your Monday morning email, we had introduced something very similar, which was titled the Ask Me Anything call. I would send an email out on a Thursday, and I would give the overview of the company in terms of the good, the bad, the lowlights and the highlights of the past week. And then the next day we had a 1-hour Ask Me Anything call, and people could dial in. They didn't have to give their name. They would ask questions. And by the way, when I proposed a year later that we no longer needed the call, I thought there would be a riot in the company. People trusted us. And I think you have to have that connected tissue of trust first before you get to the culture and before you get to the strategy. Unfortunately, too many of the new leaders go into an organization. The first thing that they want to address is the mission, the vision, and they want to do it from top down. And I go back to my good friend Janine. I love what she said about bottoms up. So I think you have to have this approach to having trust. The second I would recommend, and it's very interesting because I'm looking at the Q&A and I love this one, question about how do you show your self-compassion? And for the panelists, if you remember, when I asked that question of all of you and the other 37, everybody was stumped by that question. How do you show your self-compassion? And in order, I think, to be a compassionate leader yourself, you have to make it okay to take time for yourself, to recognize that you might be in pain, and at the same time to be vulnerable. And I think that that is one of the attributes that we did uncover from the 40 leaders, is that they were not hesitant to admit when they made an error. They were not hesitant to reveal about their own personal struggles. Each one had a struggle along the way. And I'll be honest with you, for many, many years, I kept away from the organization that I had lost my hearing, that I had failed the 5th grade, that I was voted in high school as the most likely not to succeed. Can you imagine that they had such a, honor? Until I realized that by revealing that, I became more connected to the organization. That I remember one time someone saying to me, gosh, I'm glad I know all this because it makes you less boring. And so we have to gain trust. And that trust is not something that you gain overnight. It involves communication. It involves what Bruce just highlighted, sending an email out, letting people know the lowlights, the highlights, and then being able to bring the organization together in a way where they feel that they are being listened to.
Thank you, Donato. So Janine, maybe I can direct this next question to you. I'm actually going to read it word for word from the Q&A because I think it's a really important question. So it says, I work at a large academic medical center where we have a staffing crisis. Of the remaining staff, the number of people who are dealing with personal crisis of their own has reached record levels. As a result, voicemails don't get checked, mistakes are made, etc. How does one maintain their compassion while as a leader you are expected to hold people accountable, especially when the few remaining staff are expected to pick up the slack and when there are patients you need to mind?
Interesting, hard question. I think what Donato was saying about really just self-reflection and investing in yourself. So taking care of your own needs first so that you can take care of other needs. So when Scott was mentioning to have a person just in charge of a management coach. If someone needed to take care of themselves at home better, maybe they go to the management coach. Because once you take care of yourself, once you take care of your helpers, your community, they're able to deliver success in their jobs. And so making sure that they're able to have access to take care of their own needs is super important. And so that's my 2 cents on how do you deliver better services to your customers, is take care of your helpers, your employees, your base.
And if I, Sandra, if I may just add one other thing, one of our interviewees, Tasunda Brown Dockett, who is the CEO of TIA and also a member of the Robert F. Kennedy Board, she said something that I thought was very powerful. You rent your title, you own your dignity. And too many leaders get too caught up on the title and they don't relate to the individuals in the organization. To understand their pain, you have to experience their pain. And I think that that's a very important message from the book, is that, the titles leave you once you leave the organization. I've not been CEO now for 2 years at Tivity, but look at the relationships that I have still been able to maintain. And I thank the entire panelists who accepted my invitation to be part of this, and 40 others. And I really hope it was because they respect the trustful relationship that I had developed with them. And I think you have to develop that relationship, and that takes time.
Scott, let me ask you to build a little bit on what Janine said, if I may, but maybe add another twist to it, which is how do you balance being seen as a compassionate or being a compassionate leader without being perceived as being weak or easily manipulated?
That's it's tough. I think, one of the things that I do with people, especially when I feel that I've made a mistake or I've done something wrong, or maybe they think that I've done something wrong. A lot of times I'll think about it and ask them to meet with me again. And I usually do it with somebody else present. I'll say to them, I want to apologize to you, right? Because I didn't react, maybe the way I should have reacted, or I didn't give enough thought to your view. Now, the other side of this is, Sandro, when you have an institution like ours where, especially for, the more senior people, you have this ability to go to a professional who is in the business of career coaching and management coaching, and you can have a confidential conversation. I don't hear what goes on in those conversations. But there's a willingness to own their side of the responsibility. And that is really, to me, the most difficult thing, because it becomes extremely frustrating. I find myself sometimes having to make the difficult statement, which is, you're not doing your part in this, in however that relates to the existing situation. And some people are receptive of that, and they are like, I had a recent incident where, there were a number of people who were involved, and it was interesting. 2 of the 3 people, upon reflection, actually owned it. And they said, you know what, you're right, I didn't. I fell down. I didn't do my job, right? But the third person just wouldn't go there. And everybody, that's a really frustrating situation. And then, you try to encourage that person to have coaching, that, their peers, see the problem, and they reject it. And those are the most difficult situations I have with people. Is there's the great line from Shakespeare, which is where in Hamlet, where it says, this above all things to thine own self be true. But the next part people often don't quote, which is, and then it shall follow, the day is the night, that you shall find it impossible to be untrue to any man. And so when you get these people who just are not willing to look at themselves and take feedback and will not even go to a safe place for feedback, that's when you get to those difficult management situations where, in the worst cases, sometimes the conversation turns into, maybe this organization isn't the right fit for you. Maybe you need to look for, an opportunity or a culture where you feel that you would fit in better, because it just is, it's not working. But those are tough.
Sandra, maybe I could just add to that a little bit. Just maybe going out of turn here and make it a dialogue. Compassion is probably has a broader applicability. And what I mean by that, it's just not about one population. It's just not about the employee population. It's not just about the people you serve population. It has a constituency that I think you have to define broader. And one of the things, especially as you evolve in your responsibilities, you have to take all those constituencies into account to really find the way you maximize compassion, what you are serving individuals for. And I find sometimes when we just sort of focus on one population, say an employee population, and then we don't think about the patient population in healthcare as an example, or the customer population, or the individual that's giving Scott their life savings to invest in population, you become very narrow in your definition. And so when I think about the compassion and my responsibility as a leader, it's really taking the compassion for a group of people. And how am I maximizing the group of people? That might be meaning maybe holding one group more accountable, which maybe doesn't come out as being completely compassionate. But when you take it in the enterprise or the community or what you're really trying to bring, it is compassion. And I just feel leaders having that broader view of compassion is something that is important as we talk about compassion.
Thank you.
And I think building on that, Bruce, something that I've really learned and relearned in my life is that, compassion or leadership, it's just not about everyone liking you. And in fact, everyone's smiling because, you have to make hard decisions. You have to fire people who aren't performing, and you can make those decisions in a way that's compassionate. I find there's no compassion in withholding from an employee that is underperforming and not giving them feedback and letting them know how their performance is being perceived. That is unkind to keep that from an employee. It doesn't help them in their current job. It doesn't help them in their future career. And so you have to be able to have brave, courageous conversations. And you can do that in a way that fully recognizes the dignity and humanity of that person.
That's well said.
Hey, Sandro, can I ask you a question?
Please.
How does compassionate leadership impact individuals' well-being and community well-being?
Well, I came into this thinking I was going to be asking the questions, but I'll speak from a public health point of view. And then I realized I need to wrap up. I've been enraptured to this conversation. Health and well-being is ultimately a product of the world around us. It is, we constantly make the mistake of thinking that health is biologic. There's obviously a biologic element to health, but most of our health throughout our life comes from where we live and how we live and where we work, where we play. And there's abundant evidence that being in an environment that is supportive and nurturing, where you actually have a stable conditions that allow you to live your life the way you want to, is probably the single biggest thing in terms of creating a pathway for people to live healthy lives. And compassion, we're talking here compassion in the workplace. I mean, that's the theme of this. Obviously, one can talk about compassion in a much broader sense. To my mind, this represents an ethos of creating a supportive workplace environment where people spend most of their day. And that is critical to people's health. I mean, there is no question that having a workplace environment is supportive. And as I look at some of the Q&A, which I'm going to get to, it's a little bit sad making to think that many workplace environments are not that. And I think it's also a reality that no workplace environment is perfect. It's ultimately aspirational to try to get there. But a workplace environment that is supportive, compassionate, and where people feel a sense of security and well-being is ultimately essential to health. So everything we're talking about here is linked to the health of employees and the health of the public, which is where I think there's the intersection between this conversation and health. So Jeff, thank you for the question. So let me ask one last question, because I realize we've actually gone over time because I was really enjoying these questions. And maybe, Donato, I'll ask you to start and to help widen us down. I'll just go through the list again. Can you give us last concluding words? And maybe if you can fold into both what you want the audience to take about the notion of compassion leadership and also the issue of trust. I was actually going to get into trust, but then we had some other interesting topics. How do we make sure that we charge ourselves and the audience to build a trusting, compassionate environment, and to make sure that leaders see that as their responsibility to create a workplace environment, to Jeff's question, that creates health for all of us? Donato, why don't you go first?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody for being on this panel today. This conversation really validates why we launched this book, but it's not a book, it really is a movement. So I thank all of you for being a part of it. I think several things here that I'd just like to kind of comment with respect to your answer. And, one is this sense that the alternative, if you always look at the alternative, let's say we have no compassion and no kindness. Imagine what the world would be like. It would not. I mean, we're seeing this right now. When I think of examples of how, compassion is actually power, I think of President Zelensky. I think about how he has demonstrated this trait by articulating a vision, but at the same time feeling the pain of his people and staying with his people. I think the second point that we have to kind of, tear apart is when I gave the definition that compassion is, or compassionate leadership is empathy in action. Well, let's look at the opposite. What we uncovered in our research, when a leader lacks empathy, they lose the ability to adapt their approach because they can't see further than their own point of view. And look what's happening in the Ukrainian situation is the, country that, went into Ukraine, there is no empathy there. And so the ability to change your perspective because you're not understanding the pain that's being inflicted really then clouds your point of view, and you have a more closed circuit approach to how you will solve problems. My last point is, and I want to just tailgate off of what Bruce said, this book is not just for business leaders. It's not just for political leaders. We all can learn in our families how important it is to solve, if you will, this enormous loneliness situation that's occurring in our society, this sense of lost relevancy. And I do think it all stems from our inability to really show compassion and take the time to listen to understand as opposed to listening to react. That's how you're going to get the trust, is by taking the time to truly listen. And we give examples of how to do that in the book, how to listen to understand as opposed to listening to react. There has never been a debate that has been won by calling somebody an idiot, by saying to someone that they're stupid, or by showing aggression. Debates have been won by truly listening and understanding the other point of view. And I think the division that we have, not only in this country, the division that we have in the world, is really tailgating off of this notion that we've lost this sense of truly listening and understanding the pain of the other person. I'll close off by saying, I think Maya Angelou said it well when she said, quote, "I've learned that whenever I decide something with an open heart, I usually make the right decision. I've learned that even when I have pains, I don't have to be one. I've learned that every day you should reach out and touch someone. People love a warm hug or just a friendly pat on the back. I've learned that I still have a lot to learn. And I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel."
Thank you, Donato. Well, let me ask for last words. I'm going to go reverse alphabetical order now, starting from Donato. Maybe Ash, you can go next.
I just want to appreciate being brought together and having had the opportunity to have this conversation. Donato, I've been able to witness your leadership over the years, both in the decisions that you've made for your companies, and most closely to my work, the decisions that you've made with your philanthropy. And I think, we've been talking about the former on this call, but I also think as we think about our careers, the other part of our lives is how we're giving back. And this idea of compassionate leadership, of how we give to organizations and causes that we care about is important to is as important as how much we give to those causes. And I think the example that Donato and the Trumato Porter Foundation has made is really doing that through compassion and having transparency and practicing that deep listening of trying to understand what are those root causes, what are the opinions and interests of the communities that are most affected. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed being with you all today.
Thank you, Ash. Scott.
Yeah, I'll comment with what Ash said. When I've been listening to this, I'm like, I think we should all get together and do this from time to time. I think it would be a very productive exercise. To hear everybody's perspective. The one thing that I try to get people to understand is there is no compartmentalization of life. The person that you are at work is the person you are at home. If you're going to work and you're putting on an act, or you're going home and putting on a different act, you're really not being honest with yourself. You're really not being genuine. And so, when the way you're treating the people that you work with, is it the same way that you would treat your children, your husband, your wife, your parents? And the one word that comes to mind, and I use it a frequent amount, and most often with my friends, more than even at work, but is grace. And that is that you don't have to return somebody's bad act with retaliation, right? You can give people room to have a bad day. You can give people room to make mistakes. I mean what I'm about to say. I am very grateful that God has given me people in my life who practice grace. Hopefully, by the grace that's practiced with me, I learn to practice grace with others. But, I think if we would all give back to each other kindness in place of retaliation or anger or frustration, and that's hard when you're under pressure and you're tired, and I'm there all the time. But, I think if we could encourage a culture of grace within our organizations, it would make a huge difference in the quality of work, the quality of life, and I honestly think the quality of how we serve our clients and customers.
Thank you, Scott. Janine?
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I've enjoyed this time so much. I'm honored to be a part of this conversation, and I agree with each and every one of you. And foremost, I always put family first, because that is our initial time to start practicing grace and showing grace towards each other, and just allowing those mistakes to occur, and understanding that you grow from your mistakes and that you learn from them and you evolve from them, and building that network in your own home and then sharing it with others is how we all get better at just building a better culture and having compassion within every single person we touch. And so it takes no time at all to make someone smile. And so just reaching out and making someone smile, or giving your family grace and building on that grace, is how we can make it a better workplace, living place, world. And so thank you all so much for all of your comments. I've taken many notes, and I'm going to implement quite a few of your own strategies in our culture. So thank you all very much.
Okay, Janine. Bruce. I think you're on mute, Bruce.
Your question was around, building trust. And I would say a few things. I would say first that your motivations are always to serve others. And I think demonstrating those motivations. So where you start from and why are you, leading or your actions. The second thing that I've found in building trust is that you are transparent about both your actions and direction and decisions that need to be made and decisions that are challenging and what you're working through. And I find that the combination of being able to your intentions along with your actions and the transparencies of your actions has really helped in building that trust in times that there are some tough decisions that need to be made. And a little bit what Ash was talking about, this idea that tough conversations, healthy tensions and debate doesn't mean it's not compassionate. In fact, I think it's very compassionate. And Scott mentioned it a little bit in asking for people's opinion. If you're asking for diversion of opinion, that's good because it allows you to be much, much stronger in your decision making, a much more holistic view in your decision making, as opposed to being, just nice. And so I really hope people take away from what Donato has said in his book, that compassion isn't about just being nice and, as Ash said, having a friend. It's really about leading through tough times, but doing it in a way that has a purposeful intent to impact and serve others. And at the same, doing it with empathy that includes transparency, kindness, how you treat people. But it's not running away from the circumstances or not creating a nice environment.
Thank you, Bruce. Jeff, you get the last word.
Okay, great. Well, quickly, to Donato, thank you, and especially for entrusting your 2,000 colleagues with us. And in compassionate leadership, I believe, well-being is a priority. I've learned a lot, Sandro, from you in that regard, that trust is everything and earned. And in business, as Bruce said, around the area of the people we serve, we're better together, creating compassionate products that are good for mankind. And that doesn't mean you have to sacrifice the bottom line to do that.
Thank you. Everybody, thank you. I realize we're over time, but this conversation was really interesting. Donato, thank you for all you have done to catalyze this conversation. And thank you all for sharing today. And to all our audience, thank you for all